Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
First one is titled, Customer Hits No, Cancels Transaction. I leave to clock out. Recently quit my job at a convenience store. My 2 weeks were in, and it was my last day. Minutes before the end of my shift, I notice a long line and jump on register to help. 2 customers come to the register together, and one asks for cigars. Company policy and state law requires that I ID both customers. I turn to grab the cigars after asking to see ID from both, and one of the customers leaves the store. Unfortunately, in this scenario, I cannot finalize the sale until I see ID from both customers, regardless of if one leaves. I tell the customer this, and he argues with me. The manager is on the register right next to me, so I explain that no, I need to see the ID, or I cannot sell either customer age-restricted items. It's now 10:02. My shift officially ended at 10, though we are allowed to and encouraged to stay on the clock while there is a rush. The customer claims he doesn't know the other guy, even though it was clear they were together. Annoyed but just wanting to get out of this interaction, I say, whatever, and set up the terminal to take his card. He puts his card in, and the reader asks, is this amount correct? Or something of that nature. Customer hits no. A lot of customers do this, they don't read and think the screen is asking if they want cash back, but if they hit no, it cancels the transaction. Usually, we would then reset it, walking them through to make sure they hit the right button. But then I think, what's going to happen? It's my last day, I'm supposed to be clocked out. I don't care about this job, and company policy prohibits managers from giving references anyways. I say, okay, you hit no, so good night. I put the cigars back, and I clock out. After clocking out, I mention it to the manager, who says the customer looked confused for a minute and then just gave up and left, dumbfounded. Next one is titled, I just have to see an ID you don't have, convince me you're telling the truth. I used to install cable and internet for the local cable company. The company has the same name as a college football team in Ohio with red as their school color. This is my last job of the day and it's only a modem swap. I swap out their outdated modem for a new one, copy and paste their Wi-Fi name and password onto the new one, and that's it. The house is massive and in a really nice neighborhood. Get to the door, ring the bell, and the customer's son is there. Dude looks young, so I ask to see an ID to make sure he's 18 or older. Company policy 90% of the time I don't ask if the customer looks old enough. The son gets argumentative right away and starts telling me how he's in college, he's actually 21, and he even has his CCW. I tell him the policy and that he just looks young and I'm only covering my butt. This isn't good enough, he says hold on, and calls his mom, who is the actual account holder, and on her way home. I see where he gets his attitude from when he puts his mom on speakerphone and she tells me how she knows the owner of the company, she's only 5 minutes away, and that I'll be sorry if I leave before she gets there. She tells me she made that appointment and made sure someone would be there and that I should just do my job if I like having one. I just say okay, I'll just get started. I head into the basement and notice that their existing modem also does phone. Their work order, on the other hand, say to replace it with an internet-only modem. So most people that still have a landline for phone only do so for their home security system. And when I remove the phone modem and put in a non-phone modem, you no longer have a security system. By the time mom gets home, I'm all finished and the son is already connected to the Wi-Fi. I apologize, have her sign the work order, and quickly drive off. Maybe 10 minutes later, dispatch calls me and tells me how the customer has a security system and that they were supposed to get a phone modem, and would I go back? Apparently the customer's security system was blaring and wouldn't shut off. I explain the situation and how the work order didn't say anything about a phone modem. She understands and says she will have another tech head over there when someone is free. I gave the tech a heads up and he didn't get over there until late evening. Never heard anything else about it. I never did anything wrong. Next one is titled, I must be at practice and the game no matter what. Okay, then. I was in high school at the time, and the coach in question had a day job as a teacher, but this was club softball. The club offered many different sports under the overall name, and I did softball. Everybody happy? Great. So, some backstory. I played softball for most of my life. I've always loved it, and only stopped after my junior year of high school when I massively screwed up my shoulder for the last time, both for that reason and due to the horrific crap show the program became. I honestly should have seen it coming. In hindsight, the program director had been making questionable decisions since he took over. That man was a great teacher and a pretty good coach from what I hear. He coached varsity and I never made it that far. But no one should have let him make the decisions for us all. For the sake of this post, let's call him Scott. This story is about one such decision. For those who don't know, in the US, not sure about anywhere else, softball season takes place in the spring semester, even club. That means, barring weather issues, we were in the Midwest. After all, we usually had a game or two over our spring breaks, and if we didn't, we sure as hell had practice. But it was spring break, so there were always at least a few players who would up and leave on vacation for the week. Kind of a dick move, I'll acknowledge, but we were children, after all. So if our parents booked vacations, what were we supposed to do? Well, Scott decided he didn't like that. He decided in my sophomore year, so my second year of club, to make a new rule. If you missed a practice, you'd sit out half of the next game. If you missed a game, you'd sit out the whole next game. No exceptions without a valid excuse, and he made the final decision as to whether an excuse was valid. Fine, sure, whatever, we understood and expected him to be reasonable about it. Always set your expectations low, children. And if you think they're too low, lower them. Anyway, around this time I was told that I would need my wisdom teeth out. For real this time, I'd been putting it off for a while because surgery is scary and I was hoping they'd just go away, and oh boy were they. Just not at all in a good way. 3 of my teeth were impacted, and they were continuing to burrow down and up respectively to the point where the one up top was threatening to pierce my sinus cavity and the 2 lower ones were in good shape to sever the nerves in my jaw. If I waited much longer, at the very least I might never have feeling in my face again. Needless to say, we scheduled the surgery for the next available slot. Unfortunately, it was right smack in the middle of my spring break. We had a game the day after. I don't know if you've ever had your impacted wisdom teeth removed, but there was no way in hell I'd be ready for that. So, I went to Scott and told him the situation and asked if I could miss the game and the practices that followed until I was at least off the painkillers. Scott said no. Well, he said I was more than welcome to miss the game and the practices, but I'd face the consequences mentioned above. I wasn't exactly a great player, not someone vital to the team in any way, really. But I was a coach's dream in that I loved the game and always showed up ready to work, even when injured, so it's not like I was a problem kid or anything. I had no idea why he was being such a hard-a-hole about this. But I didn't want to leave my team out to dry. We only had 12 players on the whole team. We needed everybody we could get. My coaches assured me it would be fine, and if I just showed up to the game they'd count me as present and everything would be fine. So, I went and had my surgery. It went great. I got an awesome video of me when I woke up that I have no memory of whatsoever, the works. The next day, I was hopped up on painkillers, face swollen, and in uniform. Apparently our situation was more dire than we thought it would be, including me. We had 10 players. Because I was in uniform, though with no cleats and with my gear left in the car, I was added to the roster as an alternate, and they asked me to participate in the warm-up. Now after my surgery, I was put on Vicodin. Apparently, I do not react well to Vicodin. I was dizzy. I couldn't see straight. I was off balance. I felt like I was only half present in my own body. I had zero depth perception. My warm-up was a disaster. I got hit by the ball when it was thrown to me more than once. I ran into things. I think I actually straight up fell down when walking back to the dugout. Eventually my job became to just hand balls to the coach during infield warm-ups. After the game, which I sat out the whole time, thank God, my coaches tried to tell me that I didn't have to attend practice the following day. I asked if they'd cleared that with Scott. They said no, but clearly I wasn't well enough to attend. I didn't disagree, but I needed to hear that it was okay from Scott, because he didn't believe me before and he'd been adamant that I needed to be at the game and every single practice or I would be punished. They couldn't even really ask Scott because Scott was at an out-of-state tournament with varsity. So I came to practice. Not only that, but I insisted on participating. It was an absolute disaster. I felt awful the whole time, but I wasn't about to give anyone an excuse to bench me. I took 2 separate shots to the head throughout the day, even with everyone trying their hardest not to involve me. I couldn't throw straight. I couldn't run in a straight line. It took me more than 3 tries to pick up a ball off the ground because I kept missing it. No depth perception, remember? The next day, Saturday, the last day of the break, we had one more practice. I woke up that morning with a fever because it turns out you're really not supposed to do a lot of strenuous physical activity following surgery, even if it's just mouth surgery. But it wasn't a high enough fever for Scott to consider it an excused absence. We had a general list, i.e. grave illness, injury, death in the family, your own death, etc., plus extenuating circumstances that were left to Scott's discretion. So, I went to practice. Seeing me looking like absolute death, face now more swollen than it was the first day, shaking and pale, my coaches had enough. They told me to just go home, and they would deal with Scott. At that point, I felt physically awful enough that, with the reassurances from my whole team that they would not be mad, having to sit out half a game didn't actually sound that bad. So I called my mom, who hadn't actually even left, expecting my call, and went home. Well, deal with Scott they did. Apparently, he got absolutely reamed out by the athletic director and my coaches and the club's athletic trainers and my parents for not excusing me as soon as I said the word, surgery. I got a personal apology from him next time I saw him. I got to skip the next couple of practices, no consequences, until the pain came down to a point where I could stop the Vicodin altogether, which actually probably took a couple days longer than it had to, considering all I went through. Unfortunately, there wasn't much fallout beyond the apology and the excuse absence policy getting an overhaul, and Scott was still allowed to ruin my last year of softball, which is a different story for a different sub. But the look of sheer horror on his face after the thorough metaphorical butt beating he took was pretty satisfying. Now the other teacher who wouldn't listen to me about this issue, he got a little more punishment. But that's a story for another day. Next one is titled, "No, I don't think I'll change my password." You know how some companies force you to periodically change your password? I hate doing that. I always end up having to write the changed half my password on my desk so I don't forget it. I understand why they do this. Every time we change our passwords, it reduces the number of people my idiot coworker shared his password with back down to 0. And it means that maybe, just maybe, he isn't reusing it for every random website on the internet. But since I didn't either of those things, it just annoyed me to no end. So one day I'm asked to build some software for them. Basically it wired together their VoIP, voice over IP, aka internet phone, system and their instant messaging system. It had 2 parts, a program that ran on the receptionist's computer and a Windows service. A Windows service is a program that runs on your computer, but you can't see. It just quietly does its work in the background. They do all kinds of things like manage your printers, watch your battery level, maintain your internet connection, etc. Type services in Windows to see what's running on your computer. Some of these run under a computer account such as local system or network system. Others like mine needed to run as a particular person. At the start of the project, I told them they would have to create a fake user account for my Windows service. Silence was my answer. For testing, I installed my new Windows service under my own name. But I told them it would need be changed when it went to production. Still no response. On the day we installed it in its final home, my Windows service was still using my username and password. I told them again I needed a dedicated user account just for it. Again, they ignore me. It works reasonably well for a few months, then stops. Nothing works. It can't see people's IM status. It can't dial the phone. The receptionist can't do the job. I walk IT through the process of resetting the password on my Windows service to match my new password. 2 or 3 months go by, then it breaks again. Same problem, same solution. After about the 3rd time someone checks the box that says my password never expires. Victory? Epilogue. A few years later the company is bought out and the program I wrote is retired. They never did get around to giving it a dedicated user account and thus I couldn't change my password even if I wanted to. Next one is titled, Revenge from Beyond the Grave, well, beyond retirement. This is not my story. This happened at work to one of the older guys who was just about to retire as I was just joining the company. We were intended to overlap only be a few months. Luckily for me I worked with him for a couple of years. Background. I worked for a company making test equipment, mostly in the avionics field. We made a test system for an old inertial navigation system. The inertial system tester, basically moves the sensor through all three axes in precise order, speeds and combinations and verifies that it reads correctly. The test system was ancient. I mean really ancient even for the 1980s. It had a magnetic core memory, front panel programming, paper tape loader and a huge hard disk that was massive, around 18 inches, metal plate but held about 1 kilobit. It was all blink light and clicking and whizzy noises, like a futuristic computer from 60s TV shows. Our hero, who we will call Dave, was the only person in the company who knew how this thing really worked and he had worked on it for decades. The Air Force was replacing the navigation system with a new one and so the test systems would be scrapped. Dave had less than 2 years to go before retirement and so he was on a bit of a shaky peg when the project ended. Dave was also a stereotypical engineer, very good at his job, low social skills and brutally honest. He had made enemies but because the company needed him for the East and he knew everyone who dealt with the system from our company to the various air bases and air forces, and civilians, who used the system, they tolerated his manner. Dave was often called out to bases around the world to help them diagnose a problem. He was very good at his job and the air forces respected him for it. Due to the imminent scrapping of the inertial guidance system, Dave was offered early retirement and took it. As the contact was in its dying days, the project store was emptied of stacks of fan-fold paper, paper tape and other bits of useless rubbish. Due to his connections, Dave knew that the replacement system was delayed by a year and so the East service life was going to be extended. Dave knew this before the company did. Dave also knew that some component suppliers who were contracted to support the East had stopped production and scrapped the old manufacturing kit. This meant that there would be a refurb contract coming to allow the East to use modern discs to replace the obsolete dinner plate discs. Dave knew this but Dave retired anyway. That was the malicious compliance. A few weeks later a contract request came through requesting that we modify the system tester to use a more modern technology, 1.44 megabytes disks, and support the system for another year with options to renew the contract annually. As it was a simple add-on contract, it was agreed with little oversight. Then the panic set in. Nobody knew how to code the system. It was written in Fortran and a 1960s version at that, and also some machine code for an ancient processor that nobody had ever used. The majority of us had never seen the spider's web that was magnetic core memory. We didn't know where the source code had been archived and we didn't have a paper tape punching machine. We eventually found an old tape punching machine in a local newspaper of all places. They used the tape to transfer the article text from the reporter's consoles to the compositing machine. We eventually found a printout of the source code with some handwritten annotations and had no clue if that was the installed software version or not. Config Control Department did not give a damn about a 60s-era system that had remained unchanged for over a decade and they didn't know much about it. But Dave knew. And Dave was waiting for the phone call to ask. Dave agreed to come back part-time as a contractor at a sphincter-puckeringly high hourly rate for the duration of the contract. The contract was extended another 6 months sometime after taking Dave almost to his retiral date, but with a huge amount of money in his last 18 months. I liked Dave. He taught me a lot. Just for the geeks, we replaced the huge disk with a 1.44 megabytes disk, basically the same as an Amiga, and a single board computer and some custom electronics, all to pretend that it was an ancient slow disk. Basically we embedded a computer that was several orders of magnitude more powerful than the host system to pretend to be an ancient slow mechanical drive in a system with a clock rate as slow as a heartbeat. Last one is titled, Aunt's compliance with getting fired. My aunt told me this story about my birthday recently and I felt that it fit here well. When my aunt was younger, around 18, she worked at a small clothes store before going off to college. During the 2 weeks she was there after putting in her notice, she told her supervisor that my mother was pregnant with me and due any day, and that if she got the call from my father she would leave during her shift, but would come back after the birth and work what she was scheduled for the rest of her 2 weeks. Her manager agreed and said this was fine. Cue the day she gets the call from my father that my mother had gone into labor. It was raining and because of it the store wasn't busy. The manager that was working wasn't her manager, but my aunt told her anyways that she had to leave and that the other manager had already approved it and that she would come back the day after like her manager and her had a week's. The manager didn't like that answer and argued with my aunt that there wasn't enough people even though it hadn't been busy and there was another employee besides the manager. She then argued that taking time off had to be signed off, which it had been by the other manager. Finally my aunt told her that she was leaving anyways and the manager threatened her by saying that if she left she would lose her job. My aunt told her that that was fine and that she wouldn't return at all, and she didn't. Apparently my aunt's manager was very annoyed at the other manager because she had mentioned it to the other manager and they had talked about it and the fact that it meant my aunt didn't work the rest of the 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.